10. War. A folktale collected in 1924 by François Marie Savina, the French missionary, reports that when the Hmong lived in the primordial northern homeland where the days and nights were 6 months long, they were once involved in a land dispute with some neighboring tribes. Their king resolved it as follows. Each tribe would select an envoy who would walk as far as he could during the 6 months between sunset to sunrise, returning to the king's golden palace at the end of his journey. All the territory he covered would belong to his tribe. If one of the envoys failed to reach the palace, his tribe would be commanded to live wherever he stood at the moment the sun rose. At daybreak, the Hmong envoy was standing on a high pinnacle, and this is why, ever since then, the Hmong have always lived in the mountains, where they are the first to see the sun rise and the last to see it set. If that footsore walker had ended up standing on the plains instead, the fate of the Hmong would have been entirely different. Almost every aspect of the tribe's history and character proceeds from the essential fact that they are montagnards. As a Hmong proverb puts it, fish swim in the water, birds fly in the air, the Hmong live in the mountains. The Hmong language has dozens of terms for mountains of different shapes, different slopes, different elevations. Ask a Miao Hmong the name of his country of origin, wrote Savina, and he will answer with the name of a mountain. Such and such is the mountain where I was born, he will say. Ask him where that mountain happened to be, and he will indicate whether it was to the north, the south, the east, or the west, instead of telling you whether it was in China, in Tonkin, or in Laos. When a Hmong was obliged to descend to the lowlands, Savina observed, he could easily be identified by his peculiar gait. Accustomed to frequenting steep, rocky paths, he would forget he was walking on a smooth, flat road, and he would raise his foot too high with each step, as if he were climbing a staircase or feared he were going to trip. On the plain, a Miao was as much out of his element as a sailor on dry land. In pre-war Laos, the various ethnic groups were as stratified as a pousse café. The Lao lived in the plains. The Karen and the Khmu lived above the altitude of 50 meters. The Min lived above 400 meters. And finally, wrote Father Jean Motin, at the highest altitudes for the people of these regions, between 1,000 and 2,000 meters if it is possible, live the Hmong. Seek among the highest and most inaccessible mountains and there you will find them, for it is there they find themselves at home. The lowland Lao may have been richer, more numerous, and politically more powerful, but the Hmong, peering down at their putative masters like eagles looking at mice, always managed to maintain an unbudgeable sense of superiority. As it had in China, their ethnic identity remained pure. Assimilation was easy to resist because their contacts with the dominant culture were so few. They rarely visited the plains, which they called the land of leeches, believing, with some justification, given the greater incidence of tropical diseases at low elevations, that doing so would make them sick. No one passed through their territory en route to anywhere else. And although they were occasionally visited by Yananese traders bringing silver, cloth, thread, shoes, and cooking pots, they were able to keep trade to a minimum because they were so self-sufficient. They produced all their own food as well as all the fodder for their livestock, using homemade flintlock rifles, or crossbows made of wood, bamboo, and hemp. They hunted birds, rats, monkeys, gibbons, deer, wild pigs, and tigers. They fished the mountain streams. They gathered fruits, greens, wild mushrooms, tubers, and bamboo shoots. They picked slow-moving grasshoppers from the undersides of leaves in the early morning cold, and roasted them. They tied chicken feathers around the thoraxes of bees, followed them back to their hives, smoked out the bees, removed the honey, picked out the bee larvae, and steamed them. When they got thirsty in the forest, they plucked large upturned leaves shaped like dishes and drank the dew. In the Hmong language, there are hundreds of lyrical two-word expressions, not the stuff of poetry but of everyday speech, that onomatopoeically describe various sounds. These alliterative expressions, collected by the linguist Martha Ratcliffe, give some inkling of the intimate relationship the Hmong of Laos had with the natural world. Some samples: Zuj Zayag, a cicada singing, Lease loose, bees buzzing, Pludge and Plews, a boar grunting, Mig Mog, tigers playing, Igawg, wild pigs fighting in close combat, Sijed Sedge, a rat or mouse crying out in a snake's mouth. Suj zuav, a snake undulating. Tsiv tsev, birds chirping. Ruj ruav, birds shuffling through leaves looking for insects. Plig plog, a bird rising from its nest on the ground. Zig zwag, monkeys swishing through the treetops with a continuous noise. Sig tsuag, monkeys leaping through the treetops with separate noises. Nruj nriv, a tree popping fast before it falls. Nruj nrov, a tree popping slowly before it falls. Vig vag, a tree brushing through other trees and underbrush while it falls. Nkaj nkug, many trees falling one right after another. Pij poj, fruit falling on the ground. Pliv pluv, fruit falling in water. Suj zuav, a long, easy, all-day rain. Like most people who live close to the land, the Hmong were farmers. Fu Yang once told me that everyone in her village did the same work. So no one was more important than anyone else. There was no class system. Since no one knew how to read, no one felt deprived or inconvenienced by the lack of literacy. Everything the next generation needed to know was passed on orally and by example. How to venerate the ancestors. How to play the qaug. How to conduct a funeral. How to court a lover. How to track a deer. How to build a house. How to embroider a skirt. How to butcher a pig. How to flail a load of rice. Although they harvested enough rice, corn, and vegetables for their own needs, the only crop the Hmong could indisputably grow better than the lowland Lao, because it was specifically suited to the cool temperatures and alkaline soils of the highlands, was the opium poppy. There is, of course, a legend about it. Once, long ago, there was a wanton Hmong beauty whose libertinage led to her early death. From her grave grew a flower. Its pod exuded a sap whose fragrance enabled anyone who inhaled it to re-experience the ecstasy her lovers had once enjoyed. Through the medium of dreams, she initiated her posthumous acolytes into the mysteries of opium cultivation and preparation. The dreams must have been highly instructive. For ever since the end of the 18th century, when the British East India Company introduced the opium poppy to China, the Hmong have been master opium growers, drawn willy-nilly into an international trade they neither created nor controlled. In Laos, the French colonial government encouraged them to pay their taxes in raw opium, in order to supply the official lowland network of government-licensed opium dens. The Hmong complied with ease. They knew how to choose the best soil for growing opium by tasting it for its lime content. They knew how to broadcast the poppy seeds in cornfields so the young plants would be protected by the corn stalks. They knew how to incise the pods with triple-bladed knives, cutting neither so deep that the sap dripped to the ground nor so lightly that it was trapped inside the pods. Wait until the extruded sap coagulated and turned brown. Scrape it. Wrap it in poppy petals or banana leaves. Knead it, and form it into bricks. My Hmong dictionary lists 29 terms related to opium cultivation and smoking. From Ryam yib, the knife used to score the pods, to yib tsib, the needle-like tool used to hold the wad of opium while preparing it for smoking. Surprisingly few Hmong aside from the chronically ill and the elderly were addicts. Opium was reserved mainly to facilitate the ceremonial trances of tsiv neebs, to dull the pain of headaches, toothaches, snake bites, and fever, to stanch diarrhea, and to ease the discomforts of old age. Young addicts, most of whom were men, shouldered a heavy burden of shame, stigmatized by their diminished ability to work. They not only had trouble finding brides themselves but blackened the marital prospects of their brothers and cousins. The Hmong kept less than 10% of their opium yield for their own use, and sold the rest. It was their only cash crop. One could hardly invent a more perfect commodity for mountain transport, easily portable, immune to spoilage, and possessing a stratospherically high value-to-weight ratio. 1 kilogram of opium was worth as much as half a ton of rice. The saddlebags of a single modest caravan of ponies, led by a lowland merchant, could carry a village's entire annual output of crude opium bricks. The Hmong accepted no paper currency for their opium, only silver bars or piasters, which they melted down to make jewelry or hoarded for bride prices. Opium production equaled wealth. No wonder that when Christian missionaries first came to Laos, they often found small, meticulously wrapped balls of opium in their offering plates. No wonder that the parents of my interpreter believed that Maying, opium poppy, was the most beautiful name they could give their daughter. The Hmong grew their opium, as they grew their rice and corn, as a slash-and-burn crop. The more polite agricultural term is a swidden. In the dry season, the women cut away the forest underbrush with knives, and the men felled the trees with axes. Then the men sprinted down the hillsides, igniting the piles of vegetation with torches. The flames often rose 400 feet in the air, and the swirling smoke could be seen for miles. When the charred brush had cooled enough to touch, entire families worked together to clear the debris before they planted, leaving only boulders and tree stumps. Swidden farming required no plowing, no irrigation, no terracing, no fertilizing. The topsoil was briefly enriched by the wood ashes, but 4 or 5 years of monsoons washed it away, and the remaining soil was so exhausted that 20 years could pass before it was once again productive. In the 1950s, it was estimated that the Hmong of Laos were burning about 400 square miles of land a year and, by letting the topsoil leach away, causing enough erosion to alter the courses of rivers. Opium was a particularly egregious offender, since instead of eventually reforesting like rice swiddens, old opium swiddens became covered in a coarse grass called imparata, which even animals refused to eat. The practice of swidden farming is inextricably intertwined with the migrant identity of the Hmong. The residents of a village would farm the contiguous land, abandon it in a few years when the soil became depleted, farm the land within walking distance, abandon that, build overnight shelters in order to farm even more distant land, and then, finally, move the entire village, like Elizabeth I of England, who scheduled her progresses from castle to castle in the pre-plumbing era. By departing whenever the smell became unbearable, the Hmong moved when a village's accumulation of garbage and animal feces grew unpleasant or began to make people sick. If a village got overcrowded, extended family groups sometimes established satellite villages nearby. Hmong houses, split bamboo or wooden planks lashed together with ropes and sinews, were designed to be easily dismantled, portaged, and reassembled. Hmong arts were portable too. No. Monumental sculpture, highly evolved textiles, jewelry, music, and storytelling, because they always moved in groups rather than as individuals. Their clan structure, their religion, and their cultural identity accompanied them wherever they went, constituting an essential sense of a home that inoculated them against perpetual homesickness. The life of the swidden migrant bespoke a certain prodigal faith in the earth's inexhaustible abundance. The confidence that if one field lost its fertility, one village its health, or one region its plenty, no matter, as the Hmong proverb declared, there's always another mountain. It was not a lazy attitude. Moving is difficult. When the Hmong left China for Indochina, they had committed themselves to migration as a problem-solving strategy on the most arduous scale they could imagine. And in the 1960s and 1970s, when Laos became a battleground for the Vietnam War, they found themselves repeating the process yet again, even more drastically, first within the nation's borders and eventually far beyond them. In 1961, King Savang Vathana of Laos, a well-meaning but sinulous intellectual who traced his lineage to the 8th century, quoted Proust, and drove an Edsel, lamented, "Our country is the most peaceful in the world. At no time has there ever arisen in the minds of the Lao people the idea of coveting another's wealth, of quarreling with their neighbors, much less of fighting them, and yet, during the past 20 years, our country has known neither peace nor security. Enemies of all sorts have tried to cross our frontiers, to destroy our people and to destroy our religion and our nation's aura of peace and concord. Foreign countries do not care either about our interests or peace. They are concerned only with their own interests." The Geneva Accords of 1954, signed after the French lost the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, had recognized 3 independent states in what had formerly been French Indochina: Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which was temporarily partitioned into northern and southern zones that were supposed to be reunited within 2 years. Laos was to be neutral, but this economically piddling backwater, which in 1960 had 1 stoplight in its capital and only $3 million of exports, not counting opium, was cursed by its strategic location, with Thailand and Burma to the west, Vietnam to the east, and Cambodia to the south, all of them stronger and more populous, and none of them walled off by natural barriers. Laos was unlikely to stay neutral for long. Aided by the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnamese military forces. The communist Pathet Lao became entangled in a protracted struggle with the anti-communist Royal Lao government for control of the country. At this point, the United States, which had provided covert training to the Royal Lao Army since 1955, stepped up its involvement. It may seem incredible in retrospect, wrote Clark Clifford, advisor to Presidents Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, and Carter, in his memoirs, but President Eisenhower considered the fate of that tiny, landlocked Southeast Asian kingdom the most important problem facing the U.S. In 1961, on his last day in office, Eisenhower told President-elect Kennedy that if Laos were to fall to communism, it would be only a matter of time before South Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Burma fell too. Kennedy agreed. There was only one problem. At the Geneva Conference of 1961-62, the United States, the Soviet Union, North and South Vietnam, and 10 other nations agreed to a new set of accords in which they reaffirmed the neutrality of Laos and promised not to send in any foreign troops or military personnel. This is where the Hmong entered the picture. The United States was anxious to support an anti-communist government in Laos and to cut the military supply line that the North Vietnamese ran to South Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex of roads and pathways in southeastern Laos, near the Vietnam border. But how could it intervene while maintaining at least the appearance of legitimacy, without violating the accords? American troops might be able to go to Vietnam, but not to Laos. The answer was to fight a war by proxy. Kennedy cut the Gordian knot by dispatching a cadre of CIA advisors, not of foreign troops themselves. Though in retrospect it is clear that they were military personnel who recruited, trained, and armed a secret guerrilla army of Hmong soldiers, subsequently supported by the Johnson and Nixon administrations. The Hmong army clandestine eventually came to number more than 30,000. Its soldiers fought the ground war, flew combat missions, directed airstrikes by Air America pilots, rescued downed American flyers, were dropped by helicopter and parachute to fight behind enemy lines, gathered intelligence on the movements of Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese troops, sabotaged roads and bridges, planted electronic transmitters in enemy units to pinpoint their locations for bombing raids, and intercepted material on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. At its peak, the Army Clandestine was the biggest CIA operation in the world. But until 1987, when a British investigative journalist named Christopher Robbins published a book called The Ravens, The Men Who Flew in America's Secret War in Laos, the American public had heard little about it except rumors and denials. A typical sample from the New York Times, July 4, 1962. A Defense Department spokesman labeled as untrue today charges that United States planes were dropping arms to Hmong tribesmen in Laos. In 1965, Johnson commented sanctimoniously that the problem of Laos is the refusal of the communist forces to honor the Geneva Accords. What he failed to mention was that his own country wasn't honoring them either. It was just doing a better job of keeping its violations secret. According to Robbins, the war was so classified that American Air Force pilots in Vietnam who were recruited to fly planes for Air America, the CIA's proprietary airline in Laos, didn't even know until they arrived in Laos what country they'd volunteered to fight in. It was simply called the Other Theater. At first glance, it seems crazy that the CIA recruited the most remote ethnic minority in Laos, one notorious for its lack of national consciousness, instead of the dominant lowland Lao. The explanation lay both in the shortcomings of the Lao and in the special assets of the Hmong. A Royal Lao army existed, but its soldiers had never been noted for their bellicosity. A Life magazine article of the period observed, "The Lao are among the most charming people in Asia, and the most otherworldly and least martial as well. Consequently, Lao troops have sometimes fired over the heads of the enemy rather than hurt anybody, much to the despair of American advisors. It was said that Laos soldiers were likely to lay down their weapons the first time they were attacked, or sell them on the black market. The Hmong, on the other hand, to whom the CIA, like the Lao, referred as Mio, had a 4,000-year-long reputation as scrappy fighters. In Laos, they had already proven their mettle as guerrillas during the Second World War, when They fought on the side of the Lao and the French during the Japanese occupation, and after the war. When similarly allied, they resisted the Viet Minh. The CIA thus conveniently inherited a counterinsurgent network of Hmong guerrillas that the French had organized in northern Laos 2 decades earlier. Reading American press accounts of the war from the early 60s through the early 70s, I was bemused by their simultaneous condescension toward and admiration for the Hmong, who were portrayed as noble savages with thrillingly ferocious temperaments. Like many primitive peoples, their word for enemy and a stranger is the same, and they are as likely to skewer a visitor on the arrow of a crossbow as to welcome him. Mio tribesmen are tough little primitives skilled in the savage techniques of ambush and night assault. Sketchy reports trickle down from the hills and tell of heavy damage wreaked on communist motorcades by Mio tribesmen on the pro-government warpath. The Mios have never hesitated to kill. Not only are they ready and able to use weapons, but they also climb up and down the mountains with the agility of mountain goats, setting ambushes, destroying convoys, spreading terror in the enemy's rear and then fading back into the mountains. Many Hmong had reasons of their own for defending the Royal Lao government, and thus for collaborating with the United States. Perhaps a fifth of them, mostly members and supporters of the Lo clan, which had a long-standing feud with the anti-communist Lai clan, sided with the Pathet Lao, but the great majority, including those contacted by the CIA, supported the royalist camp, not because communism was ideologically less attractive than capitalism, but because it was more apt to threaten their autonomy. It was unlikely that communist agrarian land reformers would look with favor on Hmong Swidden agriculture. Moreover, because most Hmong had sided with the French before the collapse of colonial Indochina, they feared reprisals from the North Vietnamese, who had recently inflamed old antagonisms by confiscating Hmong opium crops to trade for weapons. There were also persuasive social reasons for fighting on the royalist side. Traditionally snubbed by the lowland Lao, the Hmong were likely to gain status if they became the heroes of a military victory. Finally, many Hmong had a huge personal stake in the war because they lived in the mountains surrounding its most crucial theater of operation, the Plain of Jars, a plateau in northeastern Laos through which communist troops from the north would have to march in any attempt to occupy the administrative capital of Vientiane, on the Thai border. That the Hmong knew this strategic region like the backs of their hands was not lost on the American military leaders who recruited them. Other hill tribes also supported the royalists, but the Hmong did most of the fighting. In 1971, while testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, an Undersecretary of State named U. Alexis Johnson said, "I personally feel that although the way the operation in Laos has been run is unorthodox, unprecedented, in many ways I think it is something of which we can be proud as Americans. It has involved virtually no American casualties. What we are getting for our money is, to use the old phrase, very cost-effective." What Johnson was saying, in effect, was that Hmong lives came cheap. The annual cost of financing the army clandestine, via the CIA, the Department of Defense, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, was about $500 million. The annual cost of the Vietnam War was about $20 billion. One of the reasons for this disparity was that in 1971, Army privates in Vietnam were paid between $197.50 and $339 a month. Hmong soldiers in Laos were paid an average of $2,000 kip, $3 a month. American soldiers in Vietnam ate Army field rations, spaghetti, turkey loaf, ham and eggs, frankfurters and beans, with periodic supplements of steak, ice cream, and beer. Hmong soldiers in Laos ate rice. American pilots were sent home after a year or, if they flew over North Vietnam, after their 100th mission. The most famous Hmong pilot, Lieutenant Lai Lu, flew more than 5,000 missions before he was shot down. "There was no tour to complete," wrote Christopher Robbins. "No rest and recreation in Hong Kong or Australia. No end in sight to the war. Fly till you die," the Mio pilots said. Hmong soldiers died at a rate about 10 times as high as that of American soldiers in Vietnam. To call the Hmong American paid mercenaries, as has often been done, is to forget that mercenaries, whether lured by money or adventure, choose their profession. Not all Hmong became soldiers of their own accord. Some were forced into combat because bombing in northern Laos had obliged them to abandon their fields, and there was no other employment. Some were coerced. General Vang Pao, the CIA-supported Hmong leader of the army, clandestine, was said to punish villages that had failed to fill their soldier quotas by cutting off their food supplies or even sending his own troops to attack them. Jonas Vangay, a Hmong leader in Merced, told me soon after I met him. Vang Pao recruited by force. I was very lucky. My father had money and he paid 4 other men to serve instead of my 3 brothers and me. Father sent us to school secretly and those 4 men fight. Jonas left it at that. It was only when I knew him better, several months later, that I ventured to ask what had happened to the soldiers who had served in their stead. All 4 die, he said. Anne, after a moment of uncomfortable silence, changed the subject. Vang Pao was both the cornerstone of the war and its most cryptic figure, a natural leader who had begun his military career at 13 as an interpreter and jungle runner for the French. He rose precipitously through the ranks in the Royal Lao Army until, in the early 1950s, he was recommended for officer training school. When the captain overseeing the entrance exam noticed that this promising candidate knew almost no written French, he neatly solved the problem by dictating the answers. Years later, Vang Pao expressed no embarrassment at having cheated. He emphasized, however, that the captain had merely told him the answers, and not, as the story sometimes went, actually guided his hand. Whorehouse of shit, he told a Hmong interviewer. I know how to write. It is worth noting that this incident, far from tarnishing Vang Pao's reputation, has, for example, Ted Kennedy's fudged Spanish exam at Harvard tarnished is merely added to his mythology. This was the sort of man who could never be held back by such petty impediments as rules. By 1961, when the CIA tapped him to lead their guerrilla army, Vang Pao was already a colonel, the highest rank a Hmong had ever attained, who had sealed his influence over the Hmong by choosing wives from 3 major clans. By 1963, he was a major general. He considered himself a modern reformer who supported education, criticized slash-and-burn farming, and urged the Hmong to assimilate into Laos society. Yet he once engaged a famous Sivnib to sacrifice 2 steers in order to coax an influential Hmong neutralist over to the rightist side, and postponed at least 1 bombing sortie because the leg bones of the chickens he ate for dinner were inauspiciously positioned. He tortured North Vietnamese prisoners with electric shocks and strafed Hmong villages that collaborated with the Pathet Lao. Yet he served as a godfather and surrogate provider to hundreds of war widows and orphans. Even his enemies conceded his courage. He often accompanied his soldiers to the front lines, surviving several crash landings as well as bullet wounds in his arm and side. The CIA considered Vang Pao, according to the narration of a propaganda film of the time, a charismatic, passionate, and committed man, a patriot without a country. He was twice flown to the United States, invited to the White House, and, as the New York Times noted, during a 1969 visit to Disneyland, was given a Zorro suit as a jest that he wore recently. According to sources close to him, when he toured the Plaine de Jars, the vital area his forces recently captured, realizing that the best way to guarantee Hmong collaboration was to support their opium trade, the CIA used its Air America aircraft to pick up crude opium bricks in remote villages, and gave Vang Pao his own airline, Siang Kuang Air Transport, nicknamed Air Opium, which flew opium from the secret Hmong military base at Long Tiang, in northern Laos, to markets in Vientiane. After it was refined, much of the Hmong opium crop ended up in South Vietnam, where it helped addict an estimated 30,000 American soldiers to heroin. A large portion indirectly subsidized the army clandestine, which is one reason the war was such a bargain. I knew nothing of this. Former CIA Director Richard Helms told a reporter for Frontline, who obviously didn't believe him, in 1988, it certainly was not policy. Some of Vang Pao's recruits were sent to training camps in Thailand, others massed in Long Tiang, an abandoned opium field, surrounded on 3 sides by a protective barrier of limestone mountains, which during the war became the largest Hmong settlement in the world. New recruits drilled on the landing strip built by the CIA to accommodate cargo planes. Using cardboard targets their wives had cut from surplus butter boxes, they practiced their marksmanship with American ML rifles and M2 carbines. as well as with captured Soviet submachine guns. They also learned how to handle mortars and surplus Air Force rockets, which they fired from homemade launchers. Since they could not read, trail watchers assigned to spot North Vietnamese convoys were provided with radio transmitters whose buttons were labeled with pictures of trucks and tanks. Their CIA advisors marveled at how quickly the Hmong, accustomed to crossbows and flintlocks, mastered the technology of modern warfare. You give one of these little guys an ML rifle and 50 rounds of ammunition in the morning, said an American trainer in 1961, and when he comes back that night he'll be able to kill a man at 200 yards. Christopher Robbins reported the story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, that in the early days of the war, Hmong villagers peered under the fuselages of airplanes to determine whether they were male or female. A few years later, some of those villagers were crewing or piloting propeller-driven T-28 training planes converted to bombers. The Hmong also impressed the Americans with their adaptability. With little available timber, soldiers who had transplanted their families to Long Tieng built houses out of empty rice sacks, knocked down ammunition crates, and flattened 55-gallon oil drums. They used grenades to fish, and stuffed them inside chickens as bait for tigers. They used parachute cord to rope water buffaloes. In the United States, the conflict in Laos was called the Quiet War, as opposed to the noisy one in Vietnam, whose escalation had turned the Laotian Civil War into an international free-for-all, with the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China throwing their weight behind the path at Lao while the United States continued to back the Royal Lao. But for the Hmong, the war was anything but quiet. More than 2 million tons of bombs were dropped on Laos, mostly by American planes attacking communist troops in Hmong areas. There was an average of one bombing sortie every 8 minutes for 9 years. Between 1968 and 1972, the tonnage of bombs dropped on the Plain of Jars alone exceeded the tonnage dropped by American planes in both Europe and the Pacific during World War II. In 1971, an American reporter named T.D. Allman flew over the Plain of Jars and reported that he had counted several hundred bomb craters on a single 100-foot hill, that most of the plain's vegetation had been stripped by American defoliants, and that napalm fires burned day and night. The Plain of Jars is still pocked with craters and littered with unexploded American-made cluster bombs, ready to detonate at the accidental prodding of a hoe or the curious poke of a child. During the latter years of the war, as Hmong casualties mounted, younger and younger soldiers were recruited to fight the constant stream of well-trained North Vietnamese, who were rotated annually in tragic mountains, the Hmong, the Americans, and the secret wars for Laos. 1942 to 1992, Jane Hamilton Merritt quoted a former soldier named Vang Zu who volunteered in 1968, when he was 13. Everyone knew that Vang Pao had been a soldier at 13. So many young boys volunteered to fight to protect our land. I was a small, weak boy but determined to help my people. In my first fight, I discovered that I couldn't shoot my weapon by hand-holding it. It was too heavy. I had to find a rock or tree to steady it on before firing. That was dangerous. So, I asked Vang Pao if I could be a paratrooper. He agreed and I trained for that. On my first jump, I was so light that I floated and came down far from my unit. To solve my floating problem, the next time I jumped with a B-40 grenade launcher. That brought me down. But once on the ground, I wasn't strong enough to operate the B-40 effectively. I asked Vang Pao if I could be trained in intelligence. He agreed. That was the right place for me. In 1968, Edgar Apop Buell, a retired Indiana farmer who directed the U.S. Agency for International Development Relief Program in northern Laos, told Robert Chaplin of The New Yorker, "A few days ago, I was with Vang Pao's officers when they rounded up 300 fresh Hmong recruits. 30% of the kids were 14 years old or less, and about a dozen were only 10 years old. Another 30% were 15 or 16. The rest were 35 or over. Where were the ones in between? I'll tell you, they're all dead." In 1960, between 300,000 and 400,000 Hmong lived in Laos. There is wide disagreement over what fraction died during the war and its aftermath, with estimates ranging from a tenth, in a 1975 Washington Post report, to half, in a 1970 report to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Refugees and Escapees. Some were soldiers who died in battle. Most were civilians killed by cannon and mortar fire, bombs, land mines, grenades, post-war massacres, hunger, and disease. Whether one cause of death was chemical warfare in the form of toxic yellow rain has been the subject of abundant controversy, a debate that has diverted attention from the Holocaust that the Hmong incontestably suffered from conventional weapons. Although they suffered far worse losses per capita than the South Vietnamese, whose agonies were featured daily in the American press, the Hmong were almost completely overlooked, partly because all reporters were barred from Long Tieng. On the one occasion when an American, a British, and a French journalist did manage to sneak into Long Tieng, Vang Pao was so worried about having his secret base exposed that he decided to blow up their jeep, and was dissuaded only with great difficulty by his CIA advisors. When the Hmong were mentioned, the crucial element of American involvement was usually missing from the account, either because the reporter couldn't confirm it or because the information was embargoed. In northern Laos, 90% of the villages were affected by the war, that is to say, the inhabitants suffered casualties or were displaced, or both. Entire villages fled en masse after their houses were burned and their headmen beaten or killed during nighttime raids by the Pathet Lao, or North Vietnamese. Some villages decamped to avoid incidental bombing by American or Royal Lao aircraft. In 1971, a Hmong leader in Long Pot, a village 30 miles northwest of Long Tieng, was asked which he feared most: attacks by the enemy Pathet Lao or bombs dropped by his own allies. The bombs, he replied. The bombs. Some were evacuated by Air America, on the theory that in areas where the Pathet Lao were inevitably advancing, the communists' military gains would be diminished if they captured only land and not people. Some villages simply collapsed because all the able-bodied men were dead or fighting, and the remaining women, children, and elderly men were unable to work enough fields to feed themselves. By 1970, forced to adapt their migratory habits to wartime, more than a third of the Hmong in Laos had become refugees within their own country. Yang Dao, a Hmong scholar and government advisor, wrote at the time. In Hoa Phan and Siêng Quang provinces, the war has reached into every home and forced every individual, down to the very youngest, to make the agonizing choice of flight or death. Displaced people have taken refuge in temporary settlements to the south, where there is little to eat, where schools are non-existent, where sanitary conditions are deplorable, and where hopelessness and despair are constant companions. During these troubled times, total disorder prevailed. What government there was intervened only to attend to the most pressing situations. The heat and the rains, compounded by the lack of hygiene among people accustomed to living in relative isolation, quickly led to the spread of disease and epidemics, ravaging the teeming refugee population, particularly the children. In the space of only a few years, the southwest part of the plain of Jars, once a lush green forest where tigers roamed, has been urbanized under the pressure of a continuing exodus that has no relationship whatsoever to the normal sort of economic development linked to industrialization. Today, more than 200,000 people live in settlements and military bases ranging from 500 to 30,000 inhabitants. Confined to a mountainous strip only 50 by 90 kilometers in area, the rest of the province is total desolation. In some spheres, the Hmong reacted to these upheavals, as they had to calamities throughout their history, by grasping their traditional culture even more tightly. Yang Dao reported that displaced families who had lost their livestock continued to go through the motions of ritual sacrifice, using stones in place of animals. The dwindling practice of polygyny, which at the beginning of the war was observed mainly by leaders like Vang Pao as a status symbol, became common again as a response to the mismatched wartime survival rates of men and women. The institution of levirate marriage, in which a widow was expected to wed her dead husband's younger brother, was also revived. This practice kept the children and their inheritance in their father's clan but often saddled the new husband, who might well be 15 years old or have 10 children already, with crushing responsibilities. For the most part, though, the experience of the internal refugees was a chaotic and involuntary crash landing into 20th century culture. A popularly held notion is that the Hmong refugees who came to the United States after the war were, as one newspaper reporter put it, transplanted from Stone Age to Space Age. Not only does that view grossly underestimate the complexity of traditional Hmong culture, but it also ignores the immense social, cultural, and economic changes that many Hmong had already gone through during the course of the war itself. The way of life that had survived centuries of persecution in China, as well as the 19th century Hijra to Laos, was irreversibly altered, at least in its outward forms. Within a few years, I once asked Jonas Vongay to summarize the effects of the war on the Hmong. My parents used to travel barefoot and on horse. He said, we lived in a rural and mountainous area where we never saw a car or a bus. Suddenly, in 1960, everything went upside down. The French wars hadn't really influenced us so much. Less than 20% of the Hmong were involved in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, but with the U.S. war, it was 90%. You couldn't stay in your village. You moved around and around and around. 4 years later, when I went to Vientiane, what struck me is that you cannot see a lot of Hmong with their black clothing anymore. All are wearing khaki and green soldier clothing. And where we had lived before the war, it was all covered with forests. After the bombardments, ILNY a plus de forets. ILNYN a plus. ILNYN a plus. ILNY a rain du tout. Jonas tended to lapse into French, his fourth language, after Hmong, Lao, and Thai, when he could not adequately express his emotions in English. His fifth language. There are no more forests. There are no more. There are no more. There is nothing at all. Although some Hmong had been exposed to lowland life during and after the Second World War, many saw cars, trucks, tractors, bicycles, radios, flashlights, clocks, canned food, and cigarettes for the first time when they were forced to leave their villages for temporary relocation sites. Swidden farming was moribund. A market economy began to rise in its place, encouraged by the soldiers' cash wages and the availability of manufactured goods. Lao Kip replaced silver as a means of exchange. Long Tiang became a desultory megalopolis, an unpaved, sewerless city of more than 30,000 where Hmong ran noodle stands, cobbled shoes, tailored clothes, repaired radios, ran military jeep taxi services, and interpreted for American pilots and relief workers. Except for ceremonial occasions, many Hmong women discarded their embroidered black garments and adopted lowland Lao lungi skirts and short blouses of factory-made material. Both men and women wore polyvinyl thongs. Some children attended school, others trailed after the Americans, begging chewing gum and coins, or squatted in the dirt, playing with bullet casings instead of toys made of corn cobs and chicken feathers. Even the Hmong language adapted. Many of the traditional onomatopoeic expressions expanded to make room for new associations. Plidge plodge, the sound of bamboo breaking, gained the additional meaning of bullet impact. Vig VWG, the roar of wind or fire, now meant small airplane motor as well. Plige plodge, the sound of birds making brief flights from roost to roost, also meant helicopter propellers. A new expression, ensage and siage, meaning pushing or pulling the bolt on an M16, came into use. The most drastic change bred by the war was the loss of the single asset the Hmong prized most highly, their self-sufficiency. With their fields left rotting, their livestock abandoned, and their mountains emptied of game, more than 100,000 Hmong were kept alive by U.S. sponsored food drops, weather and enemy fire permitting. 50 tons of rice a day, delivered by parachute from Air America cargo planes. As one pilot put it, there is a whole generation of Mios who are going to be damn surprised when someone tells them that rice doesn't grow in the sky. One consequence of feeding the Hmong was that those who still lived in tillable regions could spend more time growing poppies, to the benefit of the opium trade. Not all Hmong villages and relocation sites were supplied with rice, and in those that were, the daily allotment per person was about £1, half what the Hmong were used to. The memory of the rice drops still rankles. When I asked Jonas Vongay about them, he said, "Are you accusing the Hmong to be idle or lazy? Do you think they were just waiting for rice from the sky? The Hmong have always grown their own rice. Lao used to get rice from Hmong in exchange for salt and material. The Hmong never bought rice from Lao. But in the plain area, there is not enough rice in the war. ILS and ONT plus de shoy. They no longer have any choice. In January of 1973, the United States signed the Paris Agreement, pledging to withdraw all its forces from Vietnam. 2 weeks later, on his way to Hanoi, Henry Kissinger stopped in Vientiane to talk with Prince Sovanaphobua, the Prime Minister of Laos, who feared the United States would similarly withdraw support from Laos, leaving it to the mercy of North Vietnam. The very survival of Laos rests on your shoulders, Sovanaphobua told Kissinger. But your shoulders are very broad. We are counting on you to make our neighbors understand that all we want is peace. We are a very small country. We do not represent a danger to anybody. We count on you to make them know that the Lao people are pacific by tradition and by religion. We want only to be sovereign and independent. We ask that they let us live in peace on this little piece of ground that is left to us of our ancient kingdom. Therefore we must count on our great friends the Americans to help us survive. In his 1979 memoirs, Kissinger, whose shoulders turned out to be far less broad than the prince had hoped, wrote, "I cannot, even today, recall Sovanaphobua's wistful plea without a pang of shame." In February 1973, the Vientiane Agreement was signed, calling for a ceasefire in Laos, a coalition government, and the end of American air support. USAID discontinued its relief program, and in June of 1974, the last Air America plane left Laos. On May 3, 1975, 2 weeks after the Khmer Rouge took control of Phnom Penh, 3 days after the North Vietnamese occupied Saigon, and 7 months before the Communist Lao People's Democratic Republic supplanted the 600-year-old Lao monarchy, the Pathet Lao crossed the ceasefire line into territory held by Vang Pao. On May 9, the Khao Zain Pathet Lao, the newspaper of the Lao People's Party, announced, "The Mio, Hmong, must be exterminated down to the root of the tribe." On May 10, surrounded by Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese troops, with few surviving Hmong fighter PIL, OTS and no American combat support, Vang Pao reluctantly bowed to the council of his CIA case officers and conceded that he could no longer hold Long Tieng. During the next 4 days, between 1,000 and 3,000 Hmong, mostly high-ranking army officers and their families, including the family of my interpreter, Maying Xiong, were airlifted by American planes to Thailand. During the month before the fall of Saigon on April 30, American airlifts and sealifts had evacuated more than 45,000 South Vietnamese Hmong fought to board the aircraft. Several times the planes were so overloaded they could not take off, and dozens of people standing near the door had to be pushed out onto the airstrip. On May 14, Vang Pao, in tears, told the assembled crowd, "Farewell, my brothers. I can do nothing more for you. I would only be a torment for you," and boarded an evacuation helicopter. After the last American transport plane disappeared, more than 10,000 Hmong were left on the airfield, fully expecting more aircraft to return. When it became apparent that there would be no more planes, a collective wail rose from the crowd and echoed against the mountains. The shelling of Long Tieng began that afternoon. A long line of Hmong, carrying their children and old people, started to move across the plateau, heading toward Thailand.